The executioner tightened the ropes around the condemned man's ankles. He hung upside down, his blood rushing to his head. A crowd gathered, breathless and buzzing with dread. Then came the saw, two men gripping the handle. And slowly, with surgical slowness, they began to cut upward. This was no ordinary death. It was called saw torture, and it was designed to break the soul as much as the body. The goal wasn't to kill quickly. It was to make death a prolonged, agonizing performance. And the more the victim screamed, the more satisfying it was to the crowd and the crown alike. Saw torture was used across medieval Europe, from Spain to the Ottoman Empire, but each region had its twist. The victim was tied upside down so the blood wouldn't drain away. Why? Because as long as the brain was filled with blood, the victim stayed alive longer. The pain began at the groin. The saw's serrated teeth sliced through soft tissue, slowly entering the pelvis. No screaming could match the sheer panic and humiliation of being dismembered while alive. The executioners worked in shifts. This took time. It was meant for traitors, heretics, and the unthinkably wicked, or sometimes just the politically inconvenient. In kingdoms where terror was law, the message was simple: defy us, and this is your fate. And no one who saw it forgot it. In Ottoman Turkey, it was used to punish deserters and spies. In Eastern Europe, rebels. In medieval France, entire families would be forced to watch. Sometimes, even the victim's children were lined up to kneel before the bloodied body. But the sickest part wasn't the blade, it was the performance. Executioners were trained artists of pain. They practiced the pace of sawing to draw out life. Too fast, the victim would die early. Too slow, and they'd pass out. The balance was precise and sinister. There are chilling accounts in Inquisition records describing victims who remained conscious even after the saw had split the pelvis. Some lived long enough to see their intestines fall. Eyewitnesses often vomited or fainted, but the executioners never blinked. In Spain, it was called La Sierra. In Persia, they called it Jarayat Vazda, the 12-step surgery. But no matter the name, the method was the same: cut from groin to chest, or sometimes only halfway, leaving the victim in a twitching, conscious limbo. The psychological torment was just as cruel. Many victims lost their minds before the saw touched them. They'd scream for forgiveness, offer bribes, confess to sins they never committed. It wasn't just punishment, it was psychological warfare. The church sometimes endorsed it, especially during the Spanish Inquisition. Torture was a divine method to extract confessions. In one trial, a man was sawed simply for refusing to say Ave Maria. His death took 47 minutes. But it wasn't just about pain. It was about control. Monarchs and inquisitors used the saw as a tool of fear, ensuring obedience. No peasant, soldier, or noble could sleep peacefully knowing that one wrong word could lead to the saw. And so, for centuries, the sound of a saw moving through flesh wasn't just an execution. It was a warning to everyone still breathing. And the image of a man, upside down, slowly sliced open, stayed carved into the minds of those who watched forever. Executioners were feared and needed. In many towns, they lived outside the walls, shunned by clergy and peasants. But during a public torture, they were celebrities. The crowd roared for them. Some had fan followings. They wore black hoods, not to hide, but to perform. The saw was their masterpiece. A blade, yes, but also a stage. They learned how to pause just long enough for a gasp, how to drag the teeth through skin at the perfect pace, how to keep the victim conscious, screaming, and entertaining. They were part surgeon, part butcher, part actor. Some executioners kept journals, sickening records of how long it took each man to die. One French torturer bragged he could keep a victim alive for 18 minutes while sawing through the spine. But not all were monsters. Some were former soldiers, broken by war and forced into this life. Others inherited the job from their fathers. It paid well, better than a blacksmith. But the cost? Their humanity. Many became numb, or worse, began to enjoy it. They learned to read the crowd. When the crowd wanted blood, they gave blood. But when the crowd wanted theatrics, they played their part, mocking the victim, yelling to the heavens, sometimes even pausing to pray before resuming the saw. Some even wore special robes or had assistants dressed as death. They turned torture into morbid pageantry. The saw wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol, a message. The state doesn't just kill you, it unmakes you piece by piece. In Nuremberg, an infamous executioner named Klaus kept trophies, bones, teeth, and even preserved tongues. He sawed 38 men in 7 years. His journal entry read, "God made me his hand. I only follow orders." But he rarely looked up during Mass. Some victims recognized the executioners, former neighbors, childhood friends. But pleading didn't help. Once the saw was ordered, it would be used. Slowly, ritualistically. Executioners didn't break character, because mercy wasn't in the script. There were rules, unspoken ones. Don't cut too high too fast. Don't pass out yourself. Never let the victim die before the pelvis. That was the spectacle. And if you failed, you could be punished, sometimes by the saw yourself. And yet, townspeople would bring gifts to their executioner. Meat, bread, ale, because as feared as he was, they knew he kept them safe. He punished the guilty. But deep down, everyone feared, one day, they'd be on the other end of the saw. Executioners were banned from churches, markets, even marriage in some cities. But when the time came to entertain the state with pain, they were gods in black hoods. And with every new victim, the saw sang a little louder. The saw was never just about death. It was a ritual of dehumanization, a way for rulers to remind the masses, your body, your soul, your screams, they belong to the state. And those who wielded the saw, they were merely instruments, sharpened over time. The horror of saw torture wasn't legend, it was history. Real people screamed, bled, and died by the blade. And the first documented case? The Roman Empire, 2nd century AD. A Christian martyr named Simon of Persia was sawed alive for refusing to renounce his faith. Simon refused to bow to the sun god. So they dragged him to the plaza, tied his feet, and began. The saw entered at the groin and traveled upward. Witnesses say he never stopped whispering prayers, even as blood poured from his mouth. Centuries later, in 14th century Hungary, a rebel leader named István Székely was captured and sentenced to saw torture. His crime? Organizing a peasant revolt. His punishment? Public dismemberment, with his family forced to attend. István's daughter screamed so loudly that guards beat her unconscious. His wife tried to throw herself on the blade. It didn't matter. The saw split him open in 7 minutes. One chronicler wrote, "They cut him until he split like firewood." In Spain, during the darkest years of the Inquisition, a priest named Father Luis Navarrete was accused of heresy after preaching mercy over punishment. His trial was secret. His sentence? The saw. His death? Kept off the books. He was executed at night, without witnesses, except for one scribe who defected years later. In his confession, he wrote, "He screamed the word forgiveness until his tongue split." The Vatican denied it ever happened. In Persia, under Shah Abbas I, saw torture was used to crush spies. One infamous case was that of Rahim al-Talib, accused of leaking military secrets. His execution was a public spectacle, designed to silence an empire. Witnesses described it as methodical. The executioners changed saws mid-process to maintain sharpness. Musicians played loudly to drown out the screams. But Rahim didn't scream. He locked eyes with the Shah until the blade reached his sternum. In 17th century India, under the Mughal Empire, a prince's concubine was accused of poisoning the air. She was innocent, but rivals ensured her fate. The punishment, sawed alive between temple pillars to purify the palace. Her name was Aisha, and her last words were recorded in Urdu. "The gods will cut deeper than you." Her death sparked palace rumors that led to multiple poisonings, and eventually, a royal coup. In Russia, the saw was used rarely, but one tale stands out. In 1575, under Ivan the Terrible, a noble named Mikhail Vorontsov was accused of witchcraft. He was publicly sawed, despite no evidence, simply to terrify the boyars. The saw jammed mid-process. The blade had to be removed and replaced, adding another 10 minutes to his death. Mikhail wept openly, begging for his son to be spared. Ivan nodded, then ordered the boy executed next. These were not isolated cases. They were rituals of state control, and the saw was chosen for a reason. It was slow, horrifying, and final. It turned the body into a warning, one that echoed across generations, and even now, in whispers through history. Saw torture wasn't just brutal, it was biologically engineered for maximum suffering. Medieval torturers may not have known neuroscience, but they understood one thing. blood plus nerve endings plus gravity equals prolonged agony. Hanging the victim upside down did two things. It flooded the brain with oxygen-rich blood to keep them conscious and pulled internal organs downward, away from the saw. That meant the blade met resistance and pain every step of the way. The groin is one of the body's most nerve-rich regions. The femoral artery, the genitals, the pelvic bone. The saw touched them all. Victims often vomited, lost control of their bowels, or screamed until their vocal cords tore. The teeth of the saw weren't sharp like knives. They were ragged, designed to rip, not slice. Each pull shredded tissue. And because the victim was upside down, they stayed awake, even as the saw tore through bone. The executioners alternated strokes to maintain rhythm. If the saw jammed, they'd twist it to tear through cartilage. As the blade hit the pubic symphysis, the joint between the pelvic bones, the pain intensified tenfold. Victims often lost control of their bladder and bowels within the first minute. But that wasn't mercy, it was humiliation. The crowd would laugh. Executioners sometimes used it to taunt them. Even your body betrays you. As the saw reached the spinal cord, the body convulsed violently. Muscles spasmed. The legs kicked. Blood sprayed upward in sickening arcs. And still, many victims remained awake, trapped inside their bodies. Some sawing stopped at the diaphragm, letting the victim suffocate on blood and internal collapse. Others went higher. Each rib cracked like dry wood. The heart, still beating, was sometimes visible just before the victim slipped away. Even spectators weren't immune. Some fainted. Others vomited. A few were thrilled. Doctors of the day wrote that watching saw torture could induce hysteria, arousal, or spiritual cleansing, depending on the soul. Religious officials claimed the saw exposed the true state of the soul. If a victim cursed and screamed, they were damned. If they endured in silence, they were pure. Pain became judgment. Flesh became proof. But the truth? It wasn't divine. It was neurological. The body's adrenaline slowed shock. Endorphins dulled panic. The brain's survival instinct kept the heart pounding, long after the spirit had broken. In modern terms, saw torture caused polytrauma, neurogenic shock, and central pain syndrome, conditions that should render someone unconscious. But upside-down execution reversed that. It turned the body into its own prison. And when death finally came, it was often too late to mean anything. The body was shattered. The soul already gone. The saw didn't just kill, it erased. And that was the point. To make death unforgettable for those watching. The saw may have been laid to rest centuries ago, but its legacy never died. Its horror left stains not just on stone, but on culture. In whispers, legends, and even modern media, the saw still lurks, just beneath the surface. In folklore, the saw became a punishment used in hell. In Dante's Inferno-like stories from Eastern Europe, sinners were condemned to hang eternally, cut again and again, forever alive, never dying. It became punishment beyond death. In art, painters like Goya and Bruegel depicted public executions with subtle saw symbolism: bones, woodcutters, inverted figures. The saw became a symbol of injustice, silence, and the cruelty of the state. The Nazis referenced medieval punishments in their torture manuals. In occupied Poland, resistance fighters were warned, obey, or be opened like firewood. The saw wasn't used, but the memory was still weaponized. In the Balkans, as recently as the 1990s, rumors of saw-like executions were used as psychological warfare. Even unconfirmed, the sheer mention of upside-down cutting brought terror. The legend alone had power. Pop culture wasn't immune. Horror films like Saw, Hostel, and The Witchfinder General borrowed the aesthetics: groin-to-head slicing, helpless victims, ritualized pain. The saw became entertainment. Sanitized, but not forgotten. Even in memes, dark TikToks, or edgy YouTube shorts, the imagery survives. Inverted men, rusted saws, screams layered over lo-fi beats. Gen Z didn't invent the horror. They inherited it, stylized, viral, and sometimes mockingly aesthetic. But the truth? Most people don't know it actually happened. They think the saw was just a horror story, something out of fiction. Few realize that real men, real women, and even children were torn apart like timber because of politics, faith, or fear. The saw wasn't just about death. It was about domination. The body became a canvas. Pain became performance. The law became spectacle. And centuries later, we still ask, how could humans do this to each other? Because the saw forces us to confront something deeper, our fascination with pain. We watch, we flinch, we click, we scroll, but we don't look away. And maybe that's the true horror, that we haven't changed as much as we think. So next time you hear the word medieval, don't just think of castles and knights. Think of screams in the square. Think of a saw slowly working its way upward. And remember, that horror was real.